Hey everyone, TacticAngel here, back on the PlayStation 5 to run down the history of the French battleship Strasbourg, which appears in World Warships Legends as a Tier 6 premium ship. My review for this ship in-game will follow shortly, and you should see it linked down in the description once it is available. On July 22nd, 1912, France laid down the hull of the Bretagne. She was the lead ship of the last class of battleships that France would build leading up to World War I. After the completion of the 3 ships of the Bretagne class, though several ship designs would be drawn up, and even a couple of them ordered in the coming years, after March of 1916, the French Navy would not complete another battleship for another 20 years. While the Bretagne-class dreadnoughts are pretty conventional in terms of their overall design, by the time that France re-entered the battleship business, their design philosophy had again changed. Though perhaps not obvious at first, the French took a great deal of inspiration for this new design from none other than HMS Nelson. A design decision that can be interpreted equally well as a departure from doing their own thing and having a strange attraction to unconventional designs. Opting for a design with 2 turrets, each sporting 4 guns, the Dunkirk class of battleships would manage nearly as many guns as the Nelsons without the staggered turret arrangement. Due to both the speed of these ships and also their smaller main battery in some earlier designs, these ships are sometimes referred to as battle cruisers and other times as some of the first fast battleships ever produced. Strasbourg was laid down 2 years after her sister ship in November 1934 at Saint-Nazaire. She was launched in 1936 and commissioned into service in September 1938. Most of her time before the outbreak of World War II was spent working up to full readiness and being outfitted after trials. She would join the Force du Raid alongside Dunkirk and sail with her for the first time in May 1939. Just a few short months later, the Force du Raid was sent on September 2nd looking for the Graf Spee. Essentially, the Dunkirk would sail north with elements of the Royal Navy, and Strasbourg would join still more British ships in Force X operating out of Dakar. The thought was that the German Panzerschiff might begin commerce raiding off the east coast of Africa. Ultimately, Force X would encounter German cargo ships, but no German warships. Dunkirk and Strasbourg were reunited in spring of 1940 and sailed for Mers-el-Kébir in April of that year, a major port in what was then French Algeria. Though their next sortie was to be in support of an Allied invasion of Norway alongside the British again, their presence at Mers-el-Kébir was in no small part influenced by the fear that Italy might join the war on the side of Germany. As it would turn out, this is where the majority of the French fleet was in North Africa in May 1940, when France was invaded. Though potentially helpful near the coast, the fleet did not return to France for its defense, as it was believed that the Kriegsmarine may have been sorting an attack against Gibraltar in an attempt to help the Italians gain control of the Central Sea. The Dunkirk and Strasbourg sortied for one last time together to face down the German threat, only to realize hours later that due to confusion in relative positions, the spotted German fleet was, in fact, the very same French forces trying to run them down. Returning to Mers-el-Kébir, the bulk of the French fleet would remain here until France surrendered to Germany in June 1940. This, of course, was the cause of some concern for the Royal Navy, who surely had the finest navy in service at the time, but it also had a lot of territory to cover. Allowing the French fleet to fall into the hands of the German Navy was simply unacceptable. So a force quickly sailed for Mers-el-Kébir to make sure, no matter what, the French fleet would not be joining the Regia Marina or Kriegsmarine. Without going too deeply into the motivation for the battle, the French were given several options for a non-violent resolution to the confrontation, but Admiral Gensoul refused the ultimatum offered by the British, and the Battle of Mers-el-Kébir began. The French fleet, including both Dunkirk and Strasbourg, attempted to make a break for it, but Dunkirk was struck several times and came to rest on the bottom in very shallow water, with the credit for sinking her generally attributed to HMS Hood, who landed 4 15-inch shells on her. Strasbourg made it to sea with Hood in pursuit, Fortunately for Strasbourg, the aging British battlecruiser had to turn away and then suffered engine problems, so Strasbourg was able to retreat, the only French battleship to do so that day, with the Provence being crippled by aircraft from Ark Royal and Bretagne suffering a magazine detonation that would end the career of the aged dreadnought. In fairness to the French fleet here, and even though only a couple of weeks had passed since the fall of France, the French forces at Mers-el-Kébir were hardly in a position to fight, as they had already largely disarmed the coastal defenses overseeing the port, and the French Air Force in the area was both not in particularly good condition generally, and its commander was so worried about defections to the Allies that he'd ordered the tires flattened and fluids drained from the plane's engines. Not only this, a significant portion of the French naval crew had already disembarked either because they were anticipating being sent back to France or because they were African residents who had been released from their duties. On top of this, both Strasbourg and Dunkirk were tied up in such a way that would allow them to more easily exit the port, but functionally that meant, with an all-forward-facing turret arrangement, they could not bring any guns to bear on the British fleet until they'd executed at least part of a turn. Of course, you could easily count each of those points against Gensoul, considering it would have been a challenging fight at the best of times, and going against a superior force with one arm tied behind your back is a total potato move. Ultimately, the tragedy of Mers-el-Kébir is that England proved at Alexandria around the same time that the French could accept these terms if given a better commander, and that the French would also prove later that they had no interest in handing over their ships to Germany. By all counts, the Strasbourg's escape was nearly miraculous. Its initial movements were largely covered by the voluminous smoke of basically all of the other French capital ships. It managed to evade the magnetic mines laid by the Royal Navy hours earlier, and it received no direct hits of any consequence. The brave little Regalte de Genouillet, not far from the capabilities of an escort destroyer, made a headlong charge at the British fleet, firing its torpedoes at the hood, which caused her to temporarily turn away from her pursuit. Upon returning to France, the Strasbourg would become the flagship of the newly formed Forces de Haute Mer, or the High Sea Forces. These forces were, I guess you might say, graciously permitted by the Axis to perform occasional sea trials to maintain their readiness, but saw no significant action, in spite of their very important sounding name. Following the invasion of North Africa, that we would know as Operation Torch, where other elements of the French fleet were captured by allies at Casablanca, the Germans moved against the French fleet at Toulon, and true to their word, the French scuttled the vast majority of their fleet rather than allowing it to be captured. This included the Strasbourg, and the then still damaged Dunkirk, which had also been brought there. Though sunk, that isn't quite where the end of the story is for the Strasbourg, though. Like many other ships of the French Navy in World War II, she was sunk twice. In September 1943, the ship was raised and towed to the Bay of Lazaret, where the Germans wanted to place her in a state of preservation, presumably to put her in a condition where she could be reactivated if needed. Well, that didn't quite work. She was sunk again in August 1944 by American air raids as part of Operation Dragoon. Strasbourg finished her career, being refloated again in October 1944, but at this point she was too heavily damaged to ever see service again. She was renamed after the war to Q-45 and was used in explosives testing before being sold for scrap in March 1955. And that pretty much finishes off the history of the Strasbourg. I hope you have enjoyed the video. Let me know what you think of this video format down in the comments, and as always, I hope to see you on the next one.